Welcome to the Glassworking shop. Well, I changed my mind. In the previous video, I said I wasn't going to show the resizing operation on the last Murrine pull that I made, but I think resizing is probably an interesting feature of the multi-axis squeezer, and so for those who are interested, I'm going to make the video anyway. So the first thing that I'm going to do is go out to the cold shop and cut the piece in half because it's currently too long for the squeezer. The squeezer die limitation is 4 inches, and the piece is currently, I don't know, 6.5, 7, something like that. And if you saw the last video, you'll notice that the pull came out okay. It wasn't perfectly uniform, perfectly straight, and it did have a tiny bit of a twist in it. But the resizing operation in the squeezer, it can totally fix that, and the piece comes out very nearly perfect after resizing. So I'm going to move out to the cold shop. And yeah, it's really cold out there in Northern California winter in the rain and upcoming snow. So I'm going to cut the piece in half, put it in the kiln, and then resize in the squeezer. Okay, I'm out at the cold saw in the cold shop, and as you can probably see, the right-hand piece is larger, the left-hand piece has got a little bit too thin right there, and then of course it's kind of fat at the knuckle, and so I'm going to cut not quite in the center. The center would be right there. I'm going to cut it right there and hope for the best. I'm using my prototype wet saw, which I think I'm probably not going to produce this commercially because there's a lot first of all, I don't really have the time to produce a full line of glassworking machinery, and second of all, there's lots of options out there. Covington makes good ones, and I think there's a bunch of other makers that make good ones as well, so I'm probably just going to keep this as my personal prototype. The table slides on precision linear bearings, and for this operation where I'm cutting pretty much by hand, the sliding table is not really very relevant, but for other operations like cutting the piece into chips, the sliding table is very helpful. So, being careful, slow and careful as it goes. And this gives our first look at the pattern. And let me get the camera over here. Lighting isn't really very good out here, but kind of gives the first look at the pattern, and coming out kind of cool. Okay, the pieces have been sitting in the kiln heating up for about an hour and a half, and I think that's probably good enough. I certainly don't want to risk cracking or shocking these pieces after having put this much work into it. So first thing I'm going to do is change to the squeezer dies for the final size. Now you notice that the squeezer dies are quick disconnect, and I can very quickly put in the size I'm looking for. I also engraved the sizes. See if you can see that on the camera there. I engraved the sizes on the top of these so I can easily see which ones I'm using. And these are going to be the 1 1/8" dies, which is going to be the final size that I'm shooting for. And I believe everything is ready to go. That's looking pretty good. Once again, the advantage of the fixed size squeezing dies is that they move strictly into perpendicular into the center of the piece, as opposed to the iris dies that have a little bit of sliding action, and they give a very precise result. When I get done with resizing these pieces, they're going to look very nearly perfect, or about as perfect as you can get in glass. So I'm going to get the ventilation on. Start up the torch. So, the first piece I'm going to be resizing is already on its moil, so it doesn't need to be puntied up. Make sure I get the kiln dust off of it. And I'm going to start out just gently in the far flame, very, very gentle flame. I do not want to overheat this guy too quickly. This is another one of the nice things about the NQALHA, is that it makes it easier to take your time. It makes it easier to do things slowly and gently. At least I find when I'm spinning by hand, I get impatient. I want it to go faster. My hand is getting tired. So with the NQALHA, I can just kind of like put it up there, let it go, slowly bring the piece up to temperature. And as I said in the previous video, I'm not yet an excellent puller, and so it's very, very nice to be able to resize these pieces in the squeezer. And who knows, it may turn out that even as my proficiency increases, I'll still want to use the squeezer for resizing, just to get that extra little bit of precision. Because when assembling the chips into a pattern, the more accurate they are, the less I have to do squeezing and filling gaps. And every time I fill a gap or squeeze a chip, I'm potentially introducing distortion. And even though, like I said in the previous video, part of the fun of this process is just watching what happens, watching how the glass reacts, watching how the glass flows. Once the pattern is established and I'm fusing the chips together, I really just want them to fuse. I want them to be perfect, and I want to have as close to zero distortion as I can possibly get. So, outer flame, nice soft flame on the Delta Mag. I really like the Delta Mag for this kind of work. I suspect it may be possible for someone who has a smaller torch to do work at this scale, but at least for me, I think the Delta Mag works really, really well. And who knows, as I gain confidence in this kind of work, I have no doubt that the pieces will get larger. And I have seen other glassworkers work with much larger pieces, 4 by 4 by 4 cubes, 6-inch diameter by 6-inch long, very large, irregular shape Murrine pieces. And I know it's possible, just little bit by little bit, building up my skill level, building up my confidence level. And there is nothing easy about this work. But that's what makes it fun. That's why I love it so much. Seems to be an endless challenge. So, the inside, when I'm looking at the end, it still looks mostly cold. I see a tiny bit of glow starting to come on the end. I think I'll take it out now. The NQALHA is great for the more mindless work, but when I want to have a little more control and a little more finesse and do a kind of a motion here that concentrates the heat on the flat sides, keeping trying to prevent overheating on the edges, I like to switch to handwork. So let's see what the squeeze looks like. Being fairly careful on the first squeeze. Now what I'm noticing here, I'm using the fixed size squeezing dies, and like I said before, the fixed size dies have a lot of advantages, but they also require a little bit of a workaround because the part of the piece right next to the moil is bigger than the squeezing dies. And so when I put an oversized part into the fixed size dies, it ends up kind of squishing out the corner. And as long as I'm careful and don't get too aggressive and just kind of take it easy, slow and easy, I can compensate for this by fixing those edges. The squeezing dies, it kind of squirts the glass out on the edges when the piece is larger than the fixed size squeezing die, kind of squirts the edges out, so I just need to kind of gently finesse them back into shape, trying really hard not to distort my pattern. Of course, there's almost anything you do in the flame with glass is going to result in some distortion. I just try to minimize it. Okay, this piece, except for the big end at the moil, was pulled very, very close to the correct size. Very close. So I have a pretty minimal amount of resizing to do. Another thing that I really like is having a nice long punty, because even though the resizing operation is not quite as awful as the pulling operation, still a hot torch and a hot piece of glass, and nice to be able to keep my hand at least a little bit away from it. Okay. Boy, that's looking really good. That is looking really good. This one is the easy one because the initial pull was almost correct. Of course, I wonder, every expert puller that I've ever seen, and of course I haven't seen every puller in the glass biz, I've only seen a few of them, but even the guys that know what they're doing end up with a knuckle, so maybe I shouldn't be so critical of my pulling. Maybe I'm not as bad as I think I am. Once again, I'm standing on the squeezer, which is by design. It's interesting that when I first started experimenting with squeezers, I assumed hot glass is soft. Oh, there's no need to stand on it. You just have to give it a little gentle squeeze. Well, turns out the more that I learned, the more experience I got doing this. Yeah, you do need to stand on it. And the other thing that I learned is sometimes it takes longer than I think. Sometimes even though the surface of the glass instantly freezes in contact with the squeezing dies, the core is still pretty hot and pretty soft, and so sometimes I find that I can stand on it for longer than I would have expected. and it still moves a little bit. So starting to get it very close to its final shape. Doing a little bit of corner remediation here. Another thing that kind of surprised me during the development of the squeezer, that when I first started working on it, I thought, oh, there's nothing to it. You just stick the glass in and squeeze. And then I learned, oh no, nothing in glass is simple. You don't just stick it in and squeeze. You stick it in, squeeze carefully, watching what the glass is doing, put it back in the flame using gravity and heat, concentrating heat, stretching things, condensing things. The glass, when it's being squozen, it tends to bulge in the center. And so it's always a kind of a trick to kind of like coerce it back into shape. In the process of squeezing. Because you would think, or at least I would think, naively, never having done it before, when I first invented the thing, I would think, oh, it's a uniform machine moving in parallel motion. It'll squeeze the glass uniformly. But what actually appears to happen is that the far end exposed to air is losing its heat because it's exposed to air. The moil end is losing heat because it's being conducted through the moil. So the two ends are going to be colder, and the center is going to be hotter, even if I try as hard as I can to make the heat uniform. And then when I put it in the squeezer, the hot glass in the center tends to bulge out. So that's the bad news. The good news is it's definitely possible to develop the skill to manage this and end up with a really beautiful result. I mean, I am so happy with the way these pieces come out after being resized in the squeezer. Okay, once again, got a little bit, and there's probably no way that you could see it on the camera, so I'm just going to have to describe it in words. You see how that edge, the very, very hot looking glowing edge, that's been pushed out a little bit because it's between the squeezing dies. It's kind of in the gap where the dies close, and so I need to kind of gently coerce it back into shape without introducing too horribly much distortion. Of course, a slightly off-topic comment here, since I'm just working away and remembering the past. I once was giving a presentation to a customer. One of the companies I worked at, I was giving a presentation to the customer, and I told the customer about a trick, a software trick that I had invented to reduce distortion. And I kind of was pretty proud of it, that I was going into great detail showing how my idea reduced distortion. And after the presentation was over, my coworker, who thought he was my boss but really was just a guy who has an opinion, followed me out into the parking lot and said, "Don't ever say that word. Don't say the word distortion." And I said, "What?" I told him it reduces distortion. He says, "Don't ever say bad words, ever. Don't ever say distortion. Even if you're reducing distortion, don't ever use the word." And I kind of said, "What the fuck?" So anyway, I'm working hard to reduce distortion on this piece. And if that dude is listening, well, hey, I don't obey you now any more than I did back then. So I'm kind of going to be using a little gravity here. It's still a tiny bit thick, and so I'm going to just kind of let it droop a little bit. And once again, this part of the process that actually requires a little bit of manual dexterity is best done by hand. And just over and over again, what I keep saying, the NQALHA is an assistant. You don't do your whole job on the NQALHA. You switch back and forth. You do some handwork. You do use the NQALHA, the right tool for the right job at the right time. I'm getting very, very close to final size here, and pretty close to saying I'm done. Yeah, I think that's looking really good. Okay. Well, that is about as good as it gets. So into the kiln it goes. Probably should have preheated that new punty, so I'll just speed up the video here. Of course, You know, the next one is just like the other one, so, you know, some people who maybe just want to see the operation done once don't need to see it done twice, so, you know, you can stop now. But the second one is going to be a tiny bit more challenging because it's a little bit less good of a shape and is going to require a little more work. So, hey, who knows, it might be interesting. I'm going to preheat my tweezers so that I don't shock this piece too badly. So yeah, maybe with 20/20 hindsight, I shouldn't have put that piece in the kiln with such a ratty looking end. Waiting until it stiffens up a little bit. This one is going to be a tiny bit more challenging, but probably not a tremendous lot more difficult. Yeah. A little bit of a crack appearing on my punty. Hope that won't be a problem. So while I'm gently getting some heat into this, I thought I'd talk a little bit about the future plans for the squeezer. I haven't yet determined whether or not I'm going to offer this guy for sale. It's a very useful tool, and I think a lot of glassworkers would find it useful, but it's also the squeezer and a full set of squeezing dies is a lot of parts. I mean, it's almost as many parts as a run of 10 NQALHAs. And so a squeezer and a full set of dies won't be cheap, I tell you. I'm thinking about a variety of different options. The one that seems to make the most sense is to sell the squeezer separately and then have a menu of, oh, you want this die set? Well, it's this much. You want this die set? Well, it's this much. Another possibility is to work with some of the graphite tool makers and see if any of the graphite tool makers would want to make squeezing dies for the machine. But at least at the moment, I haven't made any decision yet. And if anybody has any comments, anybody wants to say yes or no, or I'd love it, or oh no, too expensive. I can't tell you a price, so it's hard for you to say too expensive. I can't tell you a price because I haven't worked out a price yet. It's a lot of work to figure out the proper pricing on a project like this. But I would appreciate if anybody has an opinion. Should the squeezer be a product? And if so, how much would you pay? Takes a long time to soak heat into this thing, especially when I'm concerned about not overheating the surface. So just sit back, relax, let the machine do the work, at least in the beginning. I know my weld is pretty darn crappy, but hopefully it's solid enough. If I keep it hot, it's solid enough to survive the resizing process, which is really all it has to do. Okay. So I've got two challenges here. Reduce the size of the big part and increase the size of the small part. Of course, the big part, probably not a lot of usable material in the big part. Probably the part on the end is going to be so distorted and popped out, may not even be worth saving, but you never can tell. Sometimes, as I said before, sometimes glass surprises me. And often it's a pleasant surprise. Concentrating on getting those edges under control. I'm not trying to make these edges really nice. I'm not trying to use a lot of finesse. I'm just kind of like brutally beating them into shape because, like I said, the far end is most likely not going to be a really useful part of the pattern. And of course the moil, man, I don't care at all about that. Be as brutal as I want to be on the moil. And speaking of brutal, the design I did, I've got my torch top marver separately mounted from the torch, and it's mounted on a linear bearing on a 20mm rail on the front of my glass bench. And I find that it's really, really nice to not have to be concerned about moving the torch if I get a little bit too rambunctious on my marvering. Of course, I can almost imagine my teacher saying, "Don't ever get too rambunctious on your marvering. Don't be brutal with glass. Be gentle." But besides just the physical strength, having the marver separate from the torch has other advantages as well. Like I can get it out of the way if I don't need it. Now for thickening up the middle, I almost have physics on my side for that because of what I said before, that when squeezing, the middle tends to naturally bulge out because the heat tends to concentrate in the middle more than the ends. So I get a little bit of help from physics, but also I need to use a little bit of manual skill to very, very gently, because I don't want to kink or crease the piece, but if I'm very slow and very gentle, I can apply downward pressure and uniformly compress into the dies and increase thickness while reducing length. And it actually, surprisingly enough, it actually does work. Of course, I'm running into a problem here. I have to pay some attention. This giant moil is kind of getting stuck in the dies, and so if I use some gravity here, little bit by little bit, I am making progress. Trying to be gentle and careful on the corners of the part that I want to keep, and fairly aggressive, trying to get that moil thinned down a little bit. Actually, I'm pulling up a little bit on the glass to help thin out the moil. Now, once again, the squeezer absolutely does require technique. And be interesting to see if other glass workers start using it, what kind of techniques they may develop. Of course, another consideration as I'm thinking about introducing a new product to my line, I'm only one guy. And I gotta be really careful to not promise too many things that I can't deliver. So I'm using a little bit of gravity, realizing that the heat tends to concentrate in the center, which will give me some automatic thickening, kind of for free. I'm getting there. Of course, if my pole was better, I wouldn't have to do so much work on this, but I'm not sure anybody makes perfect poles. Poling is hard. Even the expert pullers that I've seen don't do it perfect. Okay, it's down to just the end now. Getting almost no squeeze out on the corners. The shape is almost finished. Getting very close now. Tiny little bit of overheating and boiling on the surface, which I never want to see, but you know, it happens. That's something that, in this process, one of my biggest problems that I've been trying to solve is little bubbles. And I think the bubbles come from two different sources. One is when I overheat and boil the glass, and the other is trapping air during assembly. Boy, I think I may stop dicking with this one. Maybe one more squeeze. So far my weld is holding. I believe it will survive the process. Of course, as I imagine very impractical, ridiculous theoretical ideas, I kind of wonder, what if I could assemble them in a vacuum? But, zooks. That's insanely hard. I don't think I'm going to be doing that one anytime soon. Well, there it is. I'm going to just give it a final little flattening on the marver, kind of reheating a little bit uniformly because the squeezing operation definitely sucks heat out of the material in a kind of a non-uniform way. So there we have it. Another piece. They're pretty much square, uniform, ready for the next operation, which will be slicing into slices, and I make the slices almost 1/4 of an inch thick, slightly less than 1/4 of an inch thick on the wet saw, so that when I assemble the pieces together and in the process of doing it kind of degrade the surface a little, even when I'm being careful, I kind of scuzz up the surface a little, and this gives me a little bit of room to work with to cold work off most of the worst of the scuzz. Of course, if I look under the microscope on all of my pieces, I see a bunch of little bubbles, and I'm always thinking, what can I do to stop it? But then again, I look at pieces made by my teachers who are really good at it, and sure enough, little bubbles. I'm kind of wondering, does anybody make a 100% bubble-free Murrine? So anyway, that's it for today's video. Thank you for watching. It's been fun.